Bacta was a staple of the Star Wars universe, a powerful healing agent that could bring the gravely wounded back from the brink of death. Only the Jedi art of force healing could repair physical damage more effectively, and as a result, Bacta was one of the most sought-after commodities in the Star Wars universe. With that said, relative to the history of the Republic, Bacta was actually fairly new. For most of galactic history, its niche as a near-miraculous healing agent was filled by Kolto, a slightly inferior substance with similar properties. Bacta and Kolto were similar in many ways, but the one we're going to be focusing on today was their exclusivity. Both substances were only produced on one planet. The lucky worlds from which these substances came, Manaan for Kolto and Thyferra for Bacta, thus had a monopoly on production of one of the galaxy's most vital resources. But Manaan and Thyferra used their monopolies in different ways, and as a result, the two worlds met with much different fates. In this video, we'll be talking about these two unique planets, their most well-known commodities, and how their different approaches to supplying the galaxy with healing juice shaped the course of their history.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
First things first, let's talk about what these two healing agents actually were. Bacta was a synthetic mixture of three compounds that were found only on Thyferra: the liquid chemical kavam, the bacteria strain Alazi, and the viscous fluid Ambori. Alazi were native to Thyferra and grew only in a medium of Giorgi, a fungus native to Thyferra, whereas kavam was derived from the natural secretions of the Vratics, Thyferra's native sentient species. Ambori acted as a liquid medium and was adjusted to mimic the vital fluids of the person to be treated, while Alazi and kavam worked together to promote rapid tissue regeneration. The Ambori base allowed the Alazi and kavam to diffuse all over a surface covered in Bacta. Both substances were drawn to open wounds, and they prompted rapid tissue regeneration while also preventing the formation of scar tissue. The presence of these compounds acted as a stimulant for natural healing processes for nearly all species, allowing the tissue of injured beings to regenerate faster. Bacta could even spur the body to heal injuries that otherwise wouldn't heal on their own. The potency of Bacta varied greatly depending on the strain. The highest quality Bacta strains could heal any wounds so long as there was the slightest spark of life left in a person, but the Vratics tended to keep these strains to themselves on Thyferra or to export them for very high prices. Components of Bacta could be synthesized or grown off-world, but Bacta itself could only be made on Thyferra proper. Kolto, meanwhile, was a yellowish fluid that worked in a similar manner to Bacta, stimulating cellular regeneration in open wounds it was exposed to. Unlike Bacta, Kolto was a natural substance found only on Manaan, and all attempts to synthesize it, of which there were many, failed. The origins and makeup of Kolto were both somewhat mysterious. Part of this was because Manaan's native Selkath closely managed Kolto production and kept many of their methods secret, but even among the Selkath, the exact nature of Kolto was unknown. Kolto bubbled up from rifts in the floor of Manaan's planet-wide ocean, primarily from the Rocket Rift below Arto City. The Selkath merely harvested and processed it once it reached the surface. Where Kolto came from or how it was produced was unknown. This was largely because the Rocket Rift was fiercely protected by an enormous Phyraxan shark with strange telepathic abilities, which it would use to drive other sharks and even the Selkath themselves into blood rages if anyone trespassed in its home. The Selkath had many legends about this creature, which they called the progenitor. Some believed that it was the foremother of their species and the source of Manaan's Kolto, while Republic scientists theorized that the progenitor instead fed on the Kolto, explaining its size and unique abilities. The Rocket Rift itself also had strange properties, which partially stemmed from the presence of an ancient Rakatan star map, a dark side artifact that had been built on Manaan in the days of the Infinite Empire, which had once ruled the planet and used the Selkath as slaves. It's unknown what influence, if any, the star map had on the development of Kolto. Bacta and Kolto worked in more or less the same way. The only difference between them was in potency, as Bacta's effects were stronger than Kolto's, though some research suggested that it hadn't always been this way, and that the potency of Kolto had somehow slowly diminished after the Jedi Civil War, leaving it as the inferior of the two substances by the time of the Empire. These healing agents were usually applied through submersion in tanks full of the fluid, the application of patches, injection, or the use of salves or supplements. During the Galactic Civil War, Bacta was often reserved for grievous wounds, while Kolto was used for lesser injuries. With that out of the way, let's move on to the fun part, the history of these substances and their producers, beginning with Manaan. Manaan was an ocean world in the Pirshak system of the Inner Rim, located quite close to the oldest and wealthiest part of the core worlds. Consequently, the Republic discovered it very early in its history, sometime between 24,000 and 20,000 BBY, during the Expansionist era. Unlike its neighbors, Manaan didn't join the Republic outright, for reasons we'll get to shortly, but it had trade deals and alliances with the galactic government for tens of thousands of years, and in practice, it functioned more or less as a part of the Republic in most respects. In any event, it integrated itself into the Republic economy, becoming an economic power player thanks to its monopoly on Kolto production. Kolto was essentially all the planet had going for it though. Manaan had no other major industries, at least not any that were open to galactic commerce, and its entire surface was covered by a vast ocean, which its people worked hard to ensure remained clean, unspoiled, and ecologically stable. The depths of this ocean were never even fully explored, not even by Manaan's native sentience, the Selkath. The Selkath were an advanced, amphibious humanoid species, a peaceful people who lived in pod-like underwater cities built on the ocean floor, where off-worlders were forbidden and the Selkath could keep to themselves. Indeed, the Selkath forbade off-worlders from venturing below the surface of Manaan's oceans at all, keeping the depths of the planet a mystery to the greater galaxy. This was how the Selkath preferred things. While they were happy to meet, learn from, and do business with other species, they generally distrusted non-Selkath and preferred to keep them at arm's length. Part of this was just ordinary xenophobia, if to a minor degree, but part of it was a matter of cultural differences. While the Selkath generally kept the greater galaxy in the dark about their culture, beliefs, and society, it was perfectly obvious to anyone who ever dealt with the Selkath court that Selkath society and the Selkath government were both strongly legalistic. Selkath law was strict and was expected to be followed to the letter without bending the rules. Violators were presumed guilty until proven innocent, and punishments tended to be strict, if usually fair. The Selkath had a rigid idea of the way society ought to be, and disliked challenges to their traditions, systems, and way of life. From the perspective of the Selkath, not only did non-Selkath often have less efficient and proper systems, but they also had a distressing tendency to bend the letter of the law and make hasty, emotionally charged, and often irrational decisions. Put simply, the Selkath tended to view non-Selkath as illogical and unpredictable. Some Selkath saw themselves as superior to off-worlders because of this, while others were simply wary of non-Selkath and their strange ways. The result was the same though. The Selkath kept everyone else at arm's length, and they took advantage of their control of the galaxy's Kolto supply to make sure that the off-worlders let them keep their independence and semi-isolation. The Selkath's general unfriendliness and the superiority complexes many of them seemed to have meant that the Selkath were often disliked by the people of the greater galaxy, but since the Selkath had a monopoly on Kolto, everyone had to keep doing business with them anyway, so it made little difference. Not long after Manaan established relations with the Republic, Kolto's miraculous healing abilities became widely known, and the Selkath Kolto export industry came into being. Demand for the substance grew rapidly, making the Selkath very wealthy and very powerful. They used their newfound wealth to build Artos City, an enormous floating metropolis designed to be the hub of the Kolto export industry. For convenience, the city was built right above the Rocket Rifts, the main source of Kolto on Manaan. Kolto bubbled up to the surface to be harvested all around the floating metropolis, where it was processed, packaged, and exported. Artos City became the sole hub of the Kolto trade, and as a result, it became heavily trafficked by Republic bulk transports and independent freighters alike. To take advantage of this, the Selkath built a robust tourism industry in Artos City as well, building cantinas, swoop lounges, hotels, shops of all descriptions, and smaller hangars for visiting passenger vessels. Swoop racing and gambling tournaments proved quite profitable for the Selkath, and they further increased the already considerable wealth of Manaan. Artos City made Manaan a major trade world, a popular destination for travelers of all sorts, from tourists to merchants. Many hyperspace routes were routed to converge in the Pyshak system, and Artos City developed a diverse population of non-Selkath immigrants. But though Manaan received plenty of traffic, none of these off-worlders ever left Artos City. Indeed, they were forbidden from doing so by Selkath law. Artos City was the public face of Selkath society, carefully maintained and separate from the rest of the Selkath world. Only the most outgoing of Selkath, or those involved in the Kolto trade, lived there, and most of Manaan's population instead lived in the Selkath's underwater cities, spending their lives in complete isolation from the outside galaxy. Artos City even had its own separate government, the Artos City Civil Authority, which was overseen by the Arto High Court and also ran the Artos City Port Authority and the Selkath Security Forces. The Arto High Court did answer to the Selkath's planetary government, which was led by a ruling council and based in one of Manaan's underwater cities, but the court generally managed its own affairs, and for the most part, Artos City functioned separately from the rest of Selkath society. Manaan supplied the outside galaxy with Kolto for 20,000 years, and in all that time, it remained firmly neutral and independent. Even as the Republic expanded and came to dominate most of the known galaxy, Manaan refused to join the Republic outright and continued to do business with third parties and even the Republic's enemies, selling Kolto to all who wanted it. The Selkath were firm in their neutrality and refused to show any party special treatment, not the Republic, not its enemies, not anyone else. This wasn't a big issue for most of Republic history, as most of the Republic's early wars were small or civil wars, which the Selkath had no problem in staying out of. Manaan was the site of one battle, the conquest of Manaan, during the Fourth Alsacan conflict in 13,220 BBY, but for the most part, it was able to avoid being affected by the Republic's wars. That was until the beginning of the Sith Wars. During the Old Sith Wars, the Republic's enemies began conquering large swaths of the galactic government's territory, establishing themselves as legitimate rivals. This became the most pronounced in the Jedi Civil War, in which Darth Revan's Sith Empire conquered a full third of Republic territory, more than any other Republic enemy before it. The Selkath insisted on remaining neutral in the Jedi Civil War, as they had done in the past, but this time, their neutrality became much more of a sticking point for the galactic powers. Both the Republic and the Sith Empire sought to gain an advantage over the other by pressuring the Selkath into giving them more favorable trade deals, as both sides needed extensive amounts of Kolto for their respective war efforts. The Selkath refused to pick a side. Instead, they actually strengthened their neutrality laws, and throughout the Jedi Civil War, Manaan did business with both the Republic and the Sith, giving neither side an advantage in trade, except as punishment for breaches of the peace in Artos City. Both the Republic and the Sith were allowed to establish embassies and military garrisons in Artos City, the former to facilitate diplomacy and the latter to protect Kolto shipments. Artos City thus became the only place in the galaxy where Republic soldiers and Sith troopers could be seen walking the streets side by side, an unusual arrangement that, predictably, created a lot of tension. The Selkath forbade fights in the streets of Artos City, especially between representatives of the Republic and Sith Empire, and the Ahch-To High Court severely punished those who violated this law. When fights broke out, as was inevitable in a city where there were simultaneously Republic soldiers, Sith soldiers, and a respectable number of bars, the Ahch-To High Court subjected the government to whom the instigators belonged to Kolto sanctions, forcing them to subsidize part of the other side's Kolto shipments for a set period of time. This was meant to serve as a deterrent against breaches of the peace, but it actually had the opposite effect. The Loyalists and the Sith quickly figured out that the Selkath considered the instigators to be the ones who threw the first punch, regardless of whether they were provoked, so they regularly attempted to goad each other into starting fights. The Ahch-To High Court, which seemingly struggled to understand the irrationalities of humans and other non-Selkath, didn't do all that much to help matters. The court was composed of 5 judges, all of them firm believers in the Selkath's legalist philosophy. The court was led by Judge Selkath, while the others were Judges Josa, Nalishakan, Kota, and Dula. Selkath was a strict legalist and firmly in support of the Selkath's neutrality, although he privately harbored a preference for the Republic over the Sith. He acted as the court's swing vote when the court was divided along Loyalist and Sith-aligned lines. Kota and Josa were sympathetic to the Republic, albeit to different degrees. Kota harbored the most Loyalist sympathies by a long shot. He despised the Sith, and he was an advocate for Manaan ending its neutrality and joining the Republic. Josa was more moderate, believing that both the Republic and Sith Empire had equal fault for starting the Jedi Civil War, but he at least had enough sense to recognize that the Sith were out to conquer everything, and for that reason, he was sympathetic to the Republic. Nalishakan and Dula, meanwhile, supported the Sith Empire. Nalishakan believed there was no moral difference between the Republic and Sith Empire. The Sith Empire, he claimed, was just another expansionist power, much as the Republic once was, and he viewed the Sith as the preferable of the two, as he had a deep distrust of the Republic and its moralizing. Dula, meanwhile, was a fascist whose personal beliefs aligned closely with the cult of strength preached by the Sith. He openly supported the Sith and even abused his power as a judge to hurt the Republic, ruling against it in all but the most extreme circumstances. In summary, Ahch-To City was a powder keg, a fun place for anyone who enjoyed the worst parts of politics. As you might expect, both the Republic and the Sith hated the Selkath and their neutrality. The Sith saw the Selkath as weak fools who didn't have the guts to pick a side, while the Republic saw the Selkath as honorless cowards for equivocating between the two sides and refusing to help the Republic defend itself from the marauding Sith. The Selkath were aware of this, but they didn't care. Both sides needed Kolto, after all, and the Selkath were the only ones who could provide it. They threatened that, if either side invaded Manaan or tried to seize control of Kolto production for themselves, they would destroy the Rocket Rift and all other sources of Kolto. Arrogantly, the Selkath believed that this threat would make them untouchable by either side. Nonetheless, both the Republic and Sith worked to undermine Manaan's neutrality and take greater shares of the Kolto trade over the course of the war, often in violation of their treaties with the Selkath. The Sith kidnapped a number of Force-sensitive Selkath youths, luring them to the Sith embassy and indoctrinating them into Sith ideology. Their final goal was to use these apprentices to overthrow the Selkath government and replace it with a Sith-aligned puppet. The Republic, meanwhile, secretly allied with the few pro-Republic Selkath in Manaan's government to build a Kolto harvesting facility in the Rocket Rift. This was against Selkath law, but the facility was jointly run by the Republic and Selkath government, and the Selkath promised to allow the facility to keep running so long as it remained a secret. During his visit to Manaan, the redeemed Revan, now a Jedi, exposed both plots. The Rocket Station plot was quietly swept under the rug by the Ahch-To High Court, several of whose members were involved in the conspiracy, but the Sith plot ultimately led to Manaan formally banning the Sith Empire from the planet. This happened in the last days of the war though, so this unprecedented partisanship ultimately made very little difference. The Jedi Civil War was the most illustrative example of the Selkath's policy of neutrality, and it also shows why this policy made the Selkath deeply unpopular. The policy was openly self-serving and uncaring, and it made the Selkath seem detached and amoral, unconcerned about the fate of the galaxy, so long as they were making a profit. The Selkath were considered to be little more than profiteers, standoffish at best and xenophobic at worst, entirely unwilling to get involved, take a stand, or be part of the broader galactic community. The Selkath, for their part, failed to see what was wrong with any of this, and in any event, they believed themselves invincible. It didn't matter to them what the outside galaxy thought, so long as they were still dependent on Manaan and the Kolto trade. Unfortunately for the Selkath, however, this dependency wasn't to last. It began when Thyferra was discovered by the Republic in 4100 BBY, introducing Bacta to the galaxy. At first, this didn't make much of a difference. The Kolto trade was such a powerful force in the galactic economy, and Bacta was so little known that Kolto continued to dominate for centuries. But after the Jedi Civil War, Manaan experienced a series of major problems that it ultimately never recovered from. The first was a mysterious decline in the Kolto supply, which forced the Selkath to raise their prices, much to the displeasure of their buyers. The second was the beginning of the Great Galactic War between the true Sith Empire and the Republic. In the Great Galactic War, the Selkath once again attempted to maintain their neutrality and sell Kolto to both sides. The Sith Empire responded by bombing Manaan from orbit, leaving Ahto City and all other surface installations in ruins. The Selkath abandoned Manaan's surface, and for a time, the Kolto trade fell apart. During the subsequent Cold War, the Selkath began to rebuild and once more offered to sell Kolto to both sides. This time, the Sith were willing to accept, and during the later Galactic Wars, both the Republic and the Sith Empire maintained a presence on Manaan. Ahto City was rebuilt and the Kolto trade resumed. But Manaan had been greatly weakened, and the Sith had shown that its neutrality no longer afforded it the protection it once had. During the Third Galactic War, Manaan was attacked yet again by Darth Zarion, causing further problems for the Kolto trade. Throughout all of this, Bacta steadily became more popular. Not only was it more effective than Kolto, but due to the Selkath raising their prices, it was also cheaper. Thyferra's native sentients, the Vratics, were also much easier to deal with than the Selkath. They were much more open to the outside galaxy, and they were willing to share the secrets of Bacta and even join the Republic. For the Republic, it was a win-win situation. It got a better healing agents, and it could stop dealing with the Selkath. Bacta quickly supplanted Kolto on the galactic market, and, predictably, this slowly caused the Kolto trade to falter. By the end of the Galactic Wars, Bacta had all but completely supplanted Kolto, and Manaan's economy imploded. Manaan attempted to join the Republic in a bid to salvage the situation and regain some of its lost prestige, but the Republic snubbed them and rejected their application. Whether this was because of corruption in the Senate or the Selkath's neutrality policy coming back to bite them in the ass is unknown. Either way, Manaan fell into a steep decline. During the New Sith Wars, Ahto City and the Selkath's other surface facilities were all but abandoned. The Selkath's once orderly underwater civilization crumbled into warring city-states, and the Selkath themselves became more warlike. Selkath society had recovered somewhat by the time of the Clone Wars, and Manaan even began to export Kolto again, but Manaan was never really the same, nor were the Selkath. As Manaan steadily faded into obscurity, Thyferra rapidly rose to prominence. Like Manaan, Thyferra was located in the Inner Rim, specifically in the Jasso sector, but while Manaan was located in the Slice and was thus discovered very early in the Republic's history, Thyferra was located in the trailing sectors along the Rimmer trade route, and it was first charted much later. By the time Republic hyperspace scouts reached Thyferra, its native sentients, the Vratics, had already achieved spaceflight and colonized several moons in their home system, and they were easily integrated into the Republic. Thyferra was a hot and extremely humid world, to the point that breathing its atmosphere felt like drinking. It had 2 moons and a tropical climate, and roughly half of its surface was dominated by tropical jungles and rainforests, intercut with mountain ranges and warm seas. The other half of Thyferra was covered by vast mats of Zorzi fungus used to cultivate Alazi bacteria. The parts of Thyferra that weren't given over to cultivation were largely unspoiled, as the native Vratics preferred to live in simple villages built in the tops of Glone and Econergy trees. And Thyferra's Bacta production facilities were all located underground, built in vast cave systems, leaving Thyferra's rainforests mostly untouched. These forests were full of life, ranging from harmless, mantis-like Nitics, which the Vratics kept as pets, to the fearsome Vraticsan blood eagle, a fearsome predator with sharp talons that occasionally preyed on unlucky Vratics. The Vratics, also known as Thyferrans, were a species of hermaphroditic insectoids. They had 6 limbs, 2 arms, and 4 legs, which made them both capable climbers and impressive jumpers. Their exoskeletons were covered with small hairs, and both these hairs and their exoskeletons changed color based on the Vratics' mood. Vratics were agile and had sharp eyesight and hearing, though they preferred to rely primarily on touch over their other senses. Though Vratics were usually hermaphrodites and genderless, they adopted male and female attributes at different parts of their life cycles, though this was unnecessary for the purposes of reproduction. The Vratics were a hive species, and while they didn't have a true hive mind, they were able to telepathically communicate with Vratics they were closely related to, and they had a strong hive mentality, preferring to refer to themselves as representatives of a collective rather than individuals. Vratics were highly sociable and logical to a fault, to the point that abstract concepts like music and art didn't make much sense to them. The Vratics were extremely well adapted to the rainforests of Thyferra, and as a result, they preferred to live simple, low-tech communitarian lives out in the jungles. They lived in basic huts made out of mud and Nitic saliva, which were built in the treetops for protection from predators. This was not for a lack of high technology. As we mentioned earlier, the Vratics developed spaceflight on their own and had established off-world colonies before they encountered the Republic. The Vratics simply preferred modest, community-based lives, honest work, and a healthy environment to the urbanization and high-tech decadence many in the Republic strive towards. There were cities on Thyferra, but only 3 of them, all of which were major spaceports built around exporting Bacta. The most important of these were the original capital of Zoshixi and Zalzuk City, the largest of the 3 spaceports. Some Vratics lived in these cities, but large portions of their populations were made up of humans and other off-worlders working in the Bacta trade, which was Thyferra's only real industry. Bacta, as we mentioned earlier, was a mixture of 2 active ingredients suspended in a medium of viscous and bori, those ingredients being Alazi bacteria and the enzyme kavam. The ancient Vratics created Bacta through their natural bodily processes. They would ingest Alazi, and their bodies would combine it with kavam, which naturally occurs in Vratics biology. This allowed the Vratics to secrete small quantities of Bacta, which they used to keep prey animals alive over the course of several days as they were slowly eaten. The Vratics stopped eating live prey long before contact with the Republic though, but they held on to the knowledge of making Bacta, and eventually they figured out how to industrialize the process of Bacta production. The Vratics learned that they could cultivate Alazi in massive quantities with the help of Zorzi. The Vratics learned that they could cultivate Alazi in massive quantities with the help of Zorzi fungus, and that they could combine it in large batches with kavam milked from their own secretion glands. The blending of the 2 ingredients was overseen by a specialized class of Vratics master blenders called the Verichen, who had a deep knowledge of the different strains of Alazi, which they used to create Bacta blends with different degrees of potency. This was accomplished in those underground cave factories we mentioned earlier, which churned out enormous quantities of marketable Bacta on a daily basis for export through Thyferra's 3 spaceports. The Vratics were indispensable to the production of Bacta. They grew the Alazi, secreted the kavam, and only the Vratics Verichen were able to mix the 2 together properly. But for most of Thyferra's history, they didn't actually control the Bacta industry themselves. You see, unlike the Selkath, the Vratics were very friendly with the Republic, and they had no prejudices against off-worlders. Thyferra joined the Republic shortly after it made first contact with the galactic government in 4100 BBY, and the Vratics not only eagerly shared their Bacta with visitors from the outside galaxy, but they also let the galaxy in on the secret of Bacta production. This drew large numbers of ambitious colonists to Thyferra, predominantly humans. These colonists helped the Vratics develop Bacta production into a full-scale industry, and they set up trade agreements with the outside galaxy, allowing the vital healing agents to be exported. The Vratics did set some limits on the activities of their new neighbors, but these were mostly aimed at keeping the Offworlders from despoiling Thyferra's jungles, and the Vratics did little to ensure they remained in charge of the Bacta trade. Even as Bacta usurped Kolto's place as the galaxy's premier healing agent after the end of the old Sith Wars, Bacta production and export increasingly came under the control of Offworlder-run corporations. By the final centuries of the Republic, most of these corporations had been swallowed or driven out by two powerful cartels, the Zaltan Corporation and the Zhukfra Corporation. Both of these companies were predominantly run by humans, though most of their employees were Vratics, and they effectively controlled Thyferra, having long ago taken over its planetary government. Zhukfra was the more cutthroat and dishonest of the two, but Zaltan wasn't exactly the most moral company in the galaxy either, and together, these two companies were known as the Bacta Cartel, both infamous for their tendency to abuse their monopoly to jack up Bacta prices. Combined, the two halves of the cartel employed a management class of about 10,000 humans and 2.8 million Vratics workers. Zaltan and Zhukfra exploited the Vratics, but since they abided by the natives' wishes to preserve the environment and allow most members of the species to live traditional lives in their forest villages, and since Zaltan and Zhukfra used the Beta trade to insulate Thyferra from the exploitation of other outsiders, the Vratics tolerated the duopoly at first. During the final centuries of the Republic, however, many Vratics began to grow sick of how their planet was being exploited. These Vratics formed an insurgent group called the Ashern Circle, and in contrast to the ordinary, peaceful ways of their people, they sharpened their claws, painted their exoskeletons black, and began a campaign of terrorism and sabotage against the Bacta cartels, seeking to liberate Thyferra from the corporations. In the wake of the Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY, which was sparked by a dramatic rise in the price of Bacta, the Ashern Circle won a major victory by revealing to the galaxy that this rise in prices was the result of Zhukfra sabotaging Bacta production and deliberately price gouging the galaxy. This led to a massive uproar and legal action against the corporation, which the Ashern Circle took advantage of to stage a coup against the planet's corporatocracy. Following this coup, Thyferra came under the rule of a new Vratics-run planetary government, a representative democracy that forced Zaltan and Zhukfra to compete with new, smaller Vratics-run Bacta companies for their share of the galactic Bacta market. This ushered in a period of prosperity for Thyferra known as the Thriving Season. The Thriving Season didn't last, however. During the Clone Wars, Thyferra seceded from the Republic and joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and around the same time, Zaltan and Zhukfra regained control of the Thyferran government. During the war, Thyferra was a separatist stronghold, the headquarters of the CIS Navy's 3rd Fleet, though Zaltan and Zhukfra still sold Bacta to both sides. Following the war, Thyferra came under Imperial rule, and a new age of tyranny began. The Empire dismantled all the smaller Bacta producers that the Vratics had set up during the Thriving Season, and it gave Zaltan and Zhukfra exclusive control over the Bacta market. The two companies were made to adopt human-only executive boards, and were together recognized by the Empire as the legitimate government of Thyferra, a corporate plutocracy completely unaccountable to the Vratics. The two companies competed fiercely throughout the Imperial period, often to the detriment of the Vratics. This led to the re-emergence of the Ashern Circle, which resumed its insurgent campaign against the two companies during the Dark Times. During the Galactic Civil War, Zhukfra Corporation wholeheartedly supported the Empire and embraced the Imperial doctrine of human high culture, firmly consolidating its power and wealth in the hands of its human overseers. Zaltan Corporation, however, was more sympathetic to the native Vratics and to the Alliance to restore the Republic, and it had established relations with the Empire as a matter of necessity. Throughout the Galactic Civil War, Zaltan covertly supported the Rebel Alliance and the Ashern Circle, sending the rebels funding and much-needed shipments of Bacta, though it also continued to supply Bacta to the Empire as part of its contract. Thyferra was initially liberated by the New Republic in 5 ABY, but the planet's troubles weren't over yet. the planet remained under corporate control, and tensions were rising on Thyferra, both between Zaltan and Giorgi and between the human colonists and the native Vratics. In 7 ABY, things got worse when Usan Isard, the former director of Imperial Intelligence and current leader of an Imperial Remnant faction, staged a coup that led to Isard being appointed Thyferra's new head of state with the backing of the Giorgi Corporation. Isard then banned the Zaltan Corporation from the planet, handing complete control of the Bacta trade over to Giorgi. Fortunately, this state of affairs didn't last. The New Republic-aligned Rogue Squadron allied with the Ashen Circle and the Zaltan Corporation to overthrow Isard in a short conflict known as the Bacta War, which ultimately saw the Vratics retake control of their homeworld. Isard was driven from Thyferra, which became a Vratics-controlled representative democracy once again. The power of the Bacta cartel was greatly diminished, and Zaltan and Giorgi were taken over by the Vratics, who began to run the Bacta trade themselves at long last. After regaining control of Thyferra, the Vratics joined the New Republic, finally free to choose their own destiny. The stories of Manaan and Thyferra are interesting in how they compare with each other. The Selkath chose the path of isolationism, believing that their control of the Kolto trade would make them invincible forever, while the Vratics chose the path of integration, in the process opening themselves up to domination by exploitative, human-run corporations. The exploitation and oppression experienced by the Vratics, which made them second-class citizens on their own homeworld, was precisely what the Selkath were trying to avoid with their isolationism and standoffish approach to the outside galaxy. But that isolationism created problems of its own, and in the end, it was the Vratics who met with a better fate. The Vratics regained control of their homeworld and the Bacta trade, becoming well-respected members of the galactic community, while the Selkath lost everything, fading into obscurity largely as a result of their own hubris. Both species ended up suffering, but the Vratics came out on top in the end, while the Selkath didn't. The reason for this isn't hard to see. The Selkath acted superior and standoffish toward non-Selkath, and their arrogance alienated the rest of the galaxy, who dealt with the Selkath only because they had no choice. When the Selkath were the only ones selling healing juice, it didn't matter. But the moment they lost that distinction, they lost everything else, and nobody was really in the mood to help them out. On the other hand, while the Vratics' over-eagerness to collaborate with other species got them into trouble, leaving them open to exploitation by outside corporations with ulterior motives, it also earned them allies, the latter of which ultimately helped them retake their homeworld and control the Bacta trade. That's not to undersell the efforts of the Vratics themselves. The commandos of the Ashen Circle more than did their part to liberate Thyferra from its exploiters, and while they had help, the Vratics did ultimately free themselves. It's also not to say that the Vratics were doing the right thing by letting themselves be exploited. They certainly could have benefited from a trace more distrust and protectionism. But it is to say that what goes around comes around, at least for the Selkath and the Vratics. So, that's our look at Manaan and Thyferra, two planets that produced some of the galaxy's most important commodities. But what do you think? Are there other planets or industries or corporations you'd like us to take a look at? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.